Elizabeth had always been a private person. Even after the death of her husband, she tried to keep to herself. She didn't want people to pity her, especially not in a small town like theirs where everyone seemed to know everyone's business. When her husband Charles passed away suddenly, Elizabeth was left with not just the weight of grief, but also a mountain of legal troubles. Charles had been a successful businessman, and his untimely death left many things up in the air. Elizabeth, who had never been involved much in the business side of things, found herself thrust into a world she knew nothing about. The paperwork, the meetings, the phone calls, it was all overwhelming. But what hit hardest were the constant reminders of her new reality. She had to make decisions about things that Charles had always handled. And now, on top of it all, she was faced with the challenge of dealing with a will that didn't seem to make sense. Charles had left behind a complicated will, and there were rumors swirling that some people weren't happy with how things were set up. The biggest issue was with his business partner, someone who had been close to him for many years. The man was claiming that Charles had made last-minute changes to the will that favored Elizabeth too much, and that some parts of it might not even be valid. But Elizabeth wasn't sure if that was true. She had always trusted Charles. She knew he had been a kind and fair man. The idea that he would make a drastic change at the last minute didn't sit right with her, especially given that the business partner stood to gain a lot more if the will were changed. Still, Elizabeth wasn't naive. She knew that when it came to money, people could become greedy, and that's exactly what she felt was happening here. This was no longer about honoring her husband's memory. It had turned into a fight over money. The business partner was determined to get what he thought he deserved, and he had hired a lawyer who seemed just as determined to make sure that happened. That lawyer's name was Victor Owens. From the moment Elizabeth saw him in court for the first time, she didn't like him. There was something about his presence that rubbed her the wrong way. He wasn't the kind of lawyer who put people at ease. Instead, he gave off an air of arrogance, like he already knew he was going to win. Victor had a reputation for being ruthless, and it wasn't lost on Elizabeth that he was someone who could easily crush people's spirits in the courtroom. When the first few hearings began, Elizabeth was taken aback by how dismissive Victor was toward her. She was a widow, a woman who had just lost her husband, and yet here she was, fighting in a courtroom over his final wishes. Every time Elizabeth spoke, it felt like Victor was looking down at her, almost as if he thought she didn't belong there. He interrupted her often, speaking over her in a condescending tone, making her feel small and insignificant. There was one moment in particular that stuck with her. During a tense session when the argument was getting heated, Victor sneered and said, "This case is hardly worth my time. If you want to drag this out, fine, but you'll only be wasting more of your own money and energy." The words stung, and Elizabeth could feel her face turn red with embarrassment. But even though she was hurt, something inside her didn't break. She was angry, not just for herself, but for Charles too. Her husband had worked hard to build his business, to create something that would provide for their future, and now this man was trying to tear it all apart. Victor's insults were a constant source of frustration. He was clever in how he played his cards, always making sure to subtly undermine Elizabeth's confidence. He didn't directly threaten her or say anything blatantly cruel, but his words were sharp, like daggers hidden in polite sentences. He would tell the judge how unprepared Elizabeth was, how she didn't understand the legal complexities of the case. Elizabeth, for the most part, kept quiet during these moments. She wasn't there to argue or fight back with words. She just wanted to get through this as quickly as possible. But as Victor continued to belittle her, something inside her began to shift. The anger she had been holding on to for weeks started to bubble to the surface. She wasn't going to let him walk all over her, and she wasn't going to let him make a fool out of Charles either. After one particularly humiliating session, Elizabeth returned home feeling defeated. The house that had once been filled with laughter and warmth now felt hollow and cold. The echo of Victor's voice, his words still ringing in her head, seemed to hang in the air. But then she remembered something. Something Charles had told her shortly before his death. He had always told her that when faced with a challenge, she should dig deep. The truth always comes out in the end, Liz. No matter how much people try to bury it, it'll always find its way to the surface. She had heard those words 1,000 times, but now, in the midst of this fight, they hit differently. Elizabeth knew that she wasn't going to win this battle with just a simple rebuttal or a few clever remarks. She needed something stronger, something that would make Victor stop in his tracks, something that would expose the truth once and for all. That night, as the weight of the case hung over her like a storm cloud, Elizabeth sat down at her desk and started going through Charles's things. She needed to go over the papers again. Every single document, every email, every note that Charles had kept. She pored over the legal documents related to his will, the letters he had written to his business partner, and even old receipts from business dealings. Hours passed, but Elizabeth didn't mind. She was determined. She knew that somewhere in the mess of paperwork, there had to be something that could turn the tables. It was well past midnight when Elizabeth found it. There, hidden in a folder marked personal, was a set of emails between Charles and a lawyer he had consulted several months before his death. Elizabeth's heart raced as she opened the first email. It was dated just weeks before Charles passed. The lawyer was advising Charles about the terms of his will, confirming changes that had been made to protect Elizabeth's interests, but also to ensure that the business partner didn't get more than what he was entitled to. The emails weren't just about the will. They also discussed the business partner's attempts to pressure Charles into making changes. Elizabeth hadn't known about these conversations before, but now, seeing the lawyer's words, she understood why the business partner was so upset. He had tried to manipulate Charles into making adjustments that would have benefited him. But Charles had held firm, even as his health began to decline. Elizabeth's hands trembled as she read through the final email. It was clear now. Charles had made his intentions clear. The business partner's claims were not just false. They were based on lies. This was the smoking gun that Elizabeth had been hoping for. For the first time since the case began, Elizabeth felt a spark of hope. The truth was right there, staring her in the face. She knew exactly what she had to do. She was ready to fight back, not just for herself, but for Charles. The battle was far from over, but Elizabeth had finally found the weapon she needed to win. The days leading up to the next court hearing were filled with a mixture of dread and determination for Elizabeth. She couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was only beginning. Victor Owens was not a man who would back down easily, and Elizabeth knew that if she didn't handle this carefully, everything she'd worked for could slip through her fingers. Every time she thought about the upcoming session, her stomach tightened. She had spent so many nights going over the details of Charles's estate, and yet she still felt the pressure weighing on her. The evidence she had found, the emails between Charles and his lawyer, was powerful, but could she really rely on it? Would it be enough to defeat Victor, a lawyer who had been in the game for years? Victor had already shown how ruthless he could be. He was never openly rude or aggressive, but his subtle arrogance was impossible to ignore. He had a way of speaking that made you feel small, almost like you didn't belong in his world. And that was exactly how he treated Elizabeth every time they were in the courtroom together. He would look at her with this smug expression, as if he already knew how the case would end. During the first hearing, Elizabeth had sat quietly, unsure of what to say or do. Victor had wasted no time in belittling her, focusing on her lack of legal knowledge and trying to paint her as someone who didn't fully understand what was at stake. She couldn't blame him for his confidence. He had been in this world for years, fighting similar battles with other families, but something about his attitude made her angry. He treated her as though she were just another widow, incapable of standing up for herself, let alone her late husband's wishes. In court, Victor would take every opportunity to make Elizabeth feel like a fool. If she stuttered or hesitated while trying to explain herself, he would mockingly shake his head and say, "This isn't how things work, Mrs. Turner. Maybe you should let your lawyer speak for you. After all, I don't think you fully grasp what's going on here." Each time he said something like that, it stung. But deep down, Elizabeth knew that letting him get under her skin would only make things worse. She had to hold her ground even if it was hard. But the more she sat there, the more she began to wonder if maybe he was right. Maybe she didn't know enough about the law. Maybe she wasn't strong enough to fight him. But as soon as those thoughts began creeping in, Elizabeth would think of Charles. She remembered how he always told her that there was strength in quiet resolve. "People don't always know what's inside you until you show them," he would say. Elizabeth had always admired that about him, how he could stand tall and firm no matter what was thrown at him. And now she had to do the same for him. She had to honor his memory, his work, and his choices. Victor wasn't just attacking her. He was attacking everything that Charles had built. Elizabeth couldn't allow that to happen, not when she knew that Charles's intentions had been clear. She had to push through the doubt and the fear no matter how difficult it was. As the next hearing approached, Elizabeth knew she couldn't keep relying on others to fight her battle. Her lawyer had been doing his best, but he was no match for Victor's experience. Elizabeth realized that if she was going to win this, she had to be her own advocate. She needed to take control of the situation. One evening, after another long day of meetings and paperwork, Elizabeth found herself sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the stack of documents she had gathered. There were old business records, tax returns, and receipts, everything she could find that might shed light on the truth. She had already gone through all of it once, but now it was time to look at it with fresh eyes. The emails she had discovered were still fresh in her mind. Elizabeth knew that they could turn the case around, but she also understood that Victor would find a way to discredit them if she didn't handle it carefully. It wasn't enough to simply present the emails in court. She had to connect the dots and make sure the evidence was rock solid. As she sifted through the papers, Elizabeth's mind raced. She began to see patterns, things she hadn't noticed before. She remembered conversations Charles had with the business partner, how he'd often mentioned how tricky the man could be. Charles had trusted him at one time, but something had changed in their relationship. The partner had been pushing for more control over the business, and Elizabeth now realized that his motives had never been entirely clear. The more she looked into it, the more Elizabeth began to understand just how much manipulation had been going on behind the scenes. The business partner had been trying to take advantage of Charles's declining health, using his vulnerability to sway him into making decisions that weren't in Elizabeth's best interest. But Charles had refused to budge, and now the business partner was trying to challenge the will to get what he thought he deserved. It was infuriating to think about how far the business partner had gone to manipulate things in his favor. But it also fueled Elizabeth's determination. She knew she had to be careful, though. She couldn't let her anger cloud her judgment. She had to think strategically. If she wanted to beat Victor and secure the will, she needed to be smart about how she played her cards. Elizabeth spent the next few days preparing. She reviewed every piece of evidence she had, including the emails, and made notes of the most important points. She also took the time to familiarize herself with the legal terms and concepts that had seemed so foreign to her at the beginning. It wasn't easy, but Elizabeth was nothing if not determined. She knew that if she didn't fight for herself and for Charles, no one else would. On the morning of the next hearing, Elizabeth woke up early, feeling a strange mix of nervousness and excitement. She had spent weeks preparing for this day, and now it was time to face Victor head-on. She put on a simple but professional outfit, trying to calm her nerves as she looked at herself in the mirror. "You can do this," she whispered to herself, as though reminding herself of the strength that had been buried deep within her all along. When she walked into the courtroom that morning, she felt different. Gone was the uncertain widow who had stumbled through the first hearings. Now there was a quiet confidence in her step, a sense of resolve that had been slowly building inside her. She wasn't going to let Victor's sneers and taunts break her. She wasn't going to let him control the narrative anymore. As she sat down, she glanced at Victor, who was already talking to his client. He didn't even glance her way, still as smug and confident as ever. He probably didn't realize that Elizabeth had come prepared this time. She wasn't just going to sit there and take it. When the hearing began, Victor wasted no time in attacking Elizabeth's credibility again, trying to discredit her evidence and suggesting that she was simply too emotionally involved to understand the intricacies of the case. But Elizabeth didn't flinch. She sat up straight, her hands resting on the table in front of her. And when the time came, she spoke up. "I have something to add," Elizabeth said calmly, interrupting Victor as he continued his remarks. Victor paused and looked at her, eyebrow raised in mock surprise. "Oh, and what is that?" Elizabeth didn't let his sarcasm shake her. She reached for the folder in front of her, her fingers trembling just a little. This was it, the moment that could change everything. She slid the emails across the table to the judge, her voice steady. "These emails were sent by my late husband, Charles, to his lawyer just weeks before his passing. They show clearly that he intended to leave the estate exactly as it is. They also show that the business partner was trying to manipulate Charles into making changes that he didn't want to make." As she spoke, she watched Victor's face. The smug look was gone. His eyes widened as he read through the emails, and for the first time Elizabeth saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. She knew she had his attention. The courtroom was a tense place, filled with hushed conversations and the sound of the judge's gavel as it echoed off the walls. Elizabeth could feel the weight of the situation pressing on her shoulders. She had been quiet for most of the morning, simply observing how the case was unfolding. But now it was her turn to speak. The moment had come. She knew she had to stay calm, to stay focused. Victor sat across the table from her, his expression unreadable. The emails Elizabeth had given to the judge were now being passed around to the other lawyers. She could see them scanning the pages quickly, their faces flickering with brief surprise as they took in what was written. Victor's lips tightened slightly, a subtle sign that he hadn't expected her to come prepared with something like this. He had underestimated her, and she could feel that it made him uncomfortable. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, Elizabeth could see a crack in his armor. The judge, an older man with a no-nonsense demeanor, looked up from the emails. His eyes met Elizabeth's, and there was a slight nod of acknowledgement. "These emails," he began, his voice steady, "seem to be important. Could you explain their significance in relation to the case?" Elizabeth's heart raced, but she kept her breathing steady. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the chance to explain what she had discovered, to finally make her case. She glanced briefly at Victor, who was sitting back in his chair now, looking a little less confident than before. The tables had turned. She stood up slowly, her voice calm but firm. "These emails were written by my late husband, Charles, to his lawyer," she began. "They are a direct reflection of his intentions regarding his will. What you need to understand is that Charles was very clear about what he wanted, and these emails confirm that." Elizabeth's hands were slightly trembling as she held the folder with the documents, but as she spoke she found that her voice grew stronger. The anger she had been suppressing for weeks, anger at the way she had been treated, anger at the way her late husband's legacy was being attacked, began to fuel her determination. She wasn't just standing up for herself now. She was standing up for Charles, for everything he had worked for, and for the future they had planned together. "The business partner," Elizabeth continued, "has been making claims about changes to the will, saying that Charles altered it in the days before his death. But as these emails show, Charles had already made his decision long before that. He was clear about his wishes, and he wasn't going to let anyone push him into changing them." As she spoke, she noticed that the room had grown quiet. Everyone was listening intently now. Even Victor, who had been so dismissive just hours before, was silent. His lips were pressed together, his hands folded tightly on the table in front of him. Elizabeth could see that the confidence he had once radiated had been replaced with something else. Doubt, perhaps. She couldn't help but feel a small sense of satisfaction at the shift in his demeanor. The judge leaned forward, his fingers tapping lightly on the desk. "These emails," he said, looking from Elizabeth to the opposing lawyer, "do seem to provide evidence of the deceased's intentions. Can you explain how these emails specifically address the claims made by the business partner?" Elizabeth took a deep breath. This was the hard part. She had to be very clear in her explanation. She had to connect the dots between the emails and the accusations Victor's team had made. If she missed one step, it could all fall apart. She couldn't afford to make any mistakes now. Charles had been in contact with his lawyer because he was concerned about the future of the business, she explained. He had started to notice that his business partner was becoming more aggressive in pushing for control. Charles knew the man was trying to influence him, to get him to make changes that would benefit him more than anyone else. But Charles was firm. These emails show that he made his decision long before his health began to decline. He knew what he wanted, and he wasn't going to let anyone, no matter how persuasive, change his mind. Elizabeth glanced down at the judge as she spoke, watching his reactions carefully. He seemed to be following along, taking everything in. But there was still the matter of convincing the others in the room. She could feel the eyes of the other lawyers on her, their gazes a mixture of curiosity and skepticism, but she couldn't let that stop her. The emails weren't just about Charles's will. They also revealed the business partner's attempts to manipulate the situation. In one of the emails, Charles had expressed concern about his partner's growing influence, how the man was trying to push him into decisions that didn't align with his values. The business partner had tried to convince Charles to rewrite parts of the will, to ensure that his interests were more heavily favored. But Charles had resisted. He was not going to be pressured into making changes just because his partner wanted more control. Victor finally spoke, breaking the silence. His voice was tight, his usual confidence nowhere to be found. This email, while it may show some correspondence between Mr. Turner and his lawyer, does not prove that the will itself is legitimate. We still have concerns about its validity, and it's clear that there were inconsistencies in how Mr. Turner executed his final wishes. Elizabeth could feel the old familiar frustration building inside her. It was the same tactic Victor had been using all along, trying to cast doubt on everything no matter how clear the evidence was. But this time she was ready for him. The will was signed and witnessed according to the law, Elizabeth replied, her tone unwavering. The only inconsistencies are the ones you are trying to create. Charles's intentions were clear. These emails, along with the will itself, make that clear. The fact that you are now trying to discredit both of them says more about your case than it does about Charles's intentions. Victor's face darkened. For a moment, Elizabeth thought he might retort sharply, but instead he just fell silent. She could see that he was struggling, trying to regain control of the narrative. But for the first time, the situation was slipping out of his grasp. The judge glanced between them, then turned to the other lawyers. "We will take a brief recess," he said, his voice firm. "I'd like to consider the evidence presented so far before we proceed further." As the room began to empty, Elizabeth sat back in her chair, her heart racing. The first round of the battle had been fought, and she felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had done it. She had stood up for herself, for Charles, and for the truth. But this wasn't over. There was still more to come. She couldn't afford to relax just yet. Victor didn't say anything as he passed her on his way out of the room. He didn't need to. His silence spoke volumes. It was the silence of someone who realized they were losing. Elizabeth didn't know if she had won yet, but for the first time, she could see the cracks in Victor's confidence. She knew now that he didn't have all the answers. He didn't have the upper hand anymore. The truth had been laid out for all to see, and there was no going back. Elizabeth stood up as the recess was called, her legs feeling unsteady. She walked slowly out of the courtroom, breathing deeply as she tried to calm her nerves. The hardest part was over. She had faced Victor, and she had won this round, but there was still more to come. The break from the courtroom gave Elizabeth a chance to breathe, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the fight wasn't over. Her mind raced as she sat in the small waiting area, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Every time she closed her eyes, she could see the judge's face, the way he had looked at her when she presented the evidence. For a moment, she felt like she had won, but deep down, she knew that the real battle had only just begun. Victor's silence during the break hadn't gone unnoticed. Elizabeth had seen the way his expression had shifted when she presented the emails. The smug confidence that had been so present in the beginning was gone, replaced by a subtle unease. He hadn't expected her to come so prepared, to have found something so concrete. She knew that his team had been relying on a strategy of doubt, a strategy that had worked in the past, but now it was falling apart. Still, Elizabeth couldn't let herself get too comfortable. She had fought hard to get this far, but there was so much left to prove. The business partner had already made his claim, and Victor wasn't about to let go of the case easily. He would fight tooth and nail to win, and Elizabeth knew that the next round would be even tougher than the last. As she sat there, her thoughts kept drifting to Charles. She thought about their life together, the years they had spent building a future. It hadn't always been easy, but they had managed to carve out a life they were proud of. The business had been his dream, something he had poured his heart and soul into, and now it was all in jeopardy. But it wasn't just the business that mattered to Elizabeth. It was Charles's legacy, his vision for what he wanted the future to look like. And that vision, as muddied as it had become with time, was still clear to her. She wasn't going to let anyone take it from her, not without a fight. When the break ended, Elizabeth was called back into the courtroom. Her heart skipped a beat as she made her way to her seat. This was it, the moment when everything would either fall apart or come together. She could feel the tension in the air, thick enough to cut with a knife. Everyone had returned to their places, and the judge was back at the bench, ready to resume the proceedings. Victor had returned to his usual self, or at least he was trying to. His posture was as confident as ever, though Elizabeth could see a flicker of wariness in his eyes. He didn't want to show it, but she could tell that he was rattled. and that gave her a sense of control, even though she knew better than to get too cocky. The legal game was far from over. The judge cleared his throat, signaling for the room to quiet down. "We are here to continue proceedings," he said. "It seems we have some new evidence to consider. Mr. Owens, I believe you would like to address the emails presented by Mrs. Turner." Victor stood up, his movements precise. "Yes, Your Honor," he said, his voice steady but lacking the same certainty it had had earlier. "We would like to request a closer review of these emails. While they do provide some insight into Mr. Turner's thoughts, they are not conclusive proof that his final will reflects his true intentions. There are inconsistencies in the document itself that cannot be ignored." Elizabeth felt her stomach drop. Victor was back to his usual tactics, casting doubt, questioning the validity of everything that stood in his way. He was trying to steer the conversation away from the emails, trying to plant the idea that the will itself was flawed. She had expected this, but it didn't make it any easier to hear. The judge nodded thoughtfully. "I see," he said.
"Mrs. Turner, do you have anything further to add in response to this?"
Elizabeth stood again, her palms sweating but her resolve as strong as ever. She knew that the more Victor tried to shift the focus, the more desperate he was becoming, and she wasn't going to let him win this. "I have already presented the evidence that clearly shows my husband's intentions," she said firmly. "The emails were written months before his death. They were not part of some last-minute change made under duress or influence. They show that Charles was thinking clearly, and that he made these decisions with full knowledge of what was at stake. The will itself is valid, and it reflects the choices he made long before his health started to fail." Her words hung in the air as the room fell silent again. Elizabeth could feel the weight of the judge's gaze, but she didn't flinch. She knew she had to stay calm. She had to stay in control. Victor's eyes narrowed slightly as he returned to his seat. His next move would be crucial. Elizabeth could see the gears turning in his head as he tried to come up with something that would turn the case back in his favor. She could feel the tension building once more, as though the room was holding its breath waiting for the next dramatic development. The judge cleared his throat again. "We will take a short recess to review the documents," he said. "Please be prepared for closing arguments when we return." Elizabeth nodded and sat down, her mind still racing. Closing arguments. This was it. She had fought hard for this moment, and now she had to bring everything together. She couldn't afford to let Victor's doubts and distractions shake her confidence. She had the truth on her side, and she wasn't going to let it slip away. The minutes that followed felt like hours. Elizabeth stared at the papers in front of her, trying to steady her thoughts. She knew that once the recess was over, the judge would make a decision, one way or another. Her heart was pounding in her chest, and every time she thought she had a handle on the situation, her mind would race off in 1,000 directions. But then, as the room slowly began to fill again, something unexpected happened. Victor's team started whispering among themselves. Elizabeth wasn't sure what they were discussing, but she could see that Victor was looking increasingly agitated. There were muttered words, quick glances exchanged, and then, for a moment, the whole room seemed to pause. Victor, the man who had been so confident just a short time ago, was visibly unsettled. He was standing in front of his team, his face a mixture of frustration and uncertainty. For the first time in this entire case, Elizabeth saw something that resembled panic in his eyes. She wasn't sure what had caused the shift, but she could feel the tension lifting slightly. Whatever Victor had planned, it wasn't working. He was losing his grip on the case, and Elizabeth could see it clearly now. She wasn't sure how things would unfold in the next few moments, but she could sense that the tide was turning. When the judge returned and called the court back to order, Elizabeth took a deep breath, her heart still racing but her mind clearer than it had been in weeks. This was her final chance. She had prepared, she had fought, and now she had to do one last thing: speak the truth. Victor stood to give his closing argument, but this time, Elizabeth noticed something different about him. His voice lacked the smoothness it had before. He fumbled with his notes a little, his words coming out more slowly than usual. It was almost as if the confidence he had once carried with him had evaporated, leaving only a man trying to hold on to a sinking ship. Elizabeth knew that the next few minutes could change everything, but one thing was certain: she had done everything she could. No matter what the outcome, she had fought for Charles's memory. She had fought for their future, and no matter what happened, she would walk away knowing she hadn't given up. The judge listened attentively to both closing arguments before he nodded, signaling the end of the proceedings. Elizabeth felt the weight of the moment in her chest. This was it. There was nothing more she could do. All she could do now was wait for the decision. The courtroom felt quieter than it ever had before. As the judge began to speak, Elizabeth's heart pounded. She had heard him set the stage for the closing arguments, but now, the weight of his words hung in the air. Her hands were still trembling slightly, but she tried to focus, to keep herself grounded. All her efforts had led to this moment, and she knew she couldn't afford to let her nerves get the better of her. Victor had wrapped up his argument, his voice still trying to sound as confident as ever, but Elizabeth could see through it. He was faltering. There was no denying it now. The case had shifted. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and the picture they formed was one that didn't support Victor's claims. But even with that knowledge, the waiting was excruciating. The judge, with his calm demeanor and the air of someone who had seen hundreds of cases like this, had yet to give his verdict. Elizabeth could feel her breath catch in her throat as he stood to speak. For the past few weeks, the judge began, his voice steady and deliberate. We have heard compelling arguments from both sides, and now it is time to make a decision. The evidence presented has been carefully reviewed. The claims made by the business partner have been examined, as have the actions of the deceased, Mr. Turner, in the final months of his life. We have seen the correspondence, we have heard the testimony. Now we must decide what is true and what is not. Elizabeth felt the weight of his words. They were important. This wasn't just some routine decision. This was about justice, about truth. And for her, it was about honoring her late husband's wishes. She could feel her pulse quicken as the judge paused, making sure his words sank in. Victor's team was silent. Elizabeth could see them exchanging glances, their faces tense, but there was no longer the air of victory around them. It was clear that they were aware of the uphill battle they were now facing. They had expected Elizabeth to crack under pressure, to buckle, but she hadn't. She had fought tooth and nail, and she had done so with a quiet strength that no one had anticipated. As the judge sat back down, he nodded to the court clerk who handed him the final documents. I've reviewed everything, and I've taken the time to consider both the legal and the moral aspects of this case, the judge continued. The evidence points to one conclusion, that Mr. Turner made his decisions regarding his estate long before his health began to decline. The emails presented by Mrs. Turner are clear, and they show that he was not influenced by outside forces at the time of making his will. There is no evidence of coercion, and no substantial reason to doubt the validity of the documents presented. Elizabeth's breath caught. The judge was speaking in her favor. She could hardly believe it. Every inch of her body was tense, and her mind raced to keep up with what was unfolding. The case, it seemed, was nearing its end. The claims made by the business partner, the judge went on, are based on suspicion, and while suspicion may lead to reasonable questions, it is not enough to overturn a valid will. The law requires clear, concrete evidence, and in this case, that evidence is lacking. Mrs. Turner has shown, through the documents provided, that her husband's wishes were clear, and the court cannot allow speculation to cloud those intentions. Elizabeth could hardly believe what she was hearing. She glanced over at Victor, his face pale, his lips pressed tightly together. She could tell that he was struggling to maintain his composure. The confidence he had once projected so easily was gone, replaced by frustration and perhaps a tinge of fear. Elizabeth had expected him to argue, to fight back with everything he had left. But he didn't. He simply sat there, his shoulders slumped, his eyes focused on the judge as if hoping for a miracle that was never going to come. The judge paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the room before he continued. Therefore, based on the evidence presented, I rule in favor of Mrs. Turner. The will that was signed by Mr. Turner is valid, and his wishes regarding the distribution of his estate will be honored. The claims of undue influence or coercion by the business partner are dismissed. Elizabeth felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had won. She had fought for what was right, for what Charles had wanted, and now the truth had been recognized. The tension in her chest slowly began to ease, and for the first time in weeks, she felt like she could breathe again. The weight of the battle she had been carrying seemed to lift, even if only for a moment. But even in the midst of that relief, Elizabeth knew that the journey wasn't quite over. The victory in the courtroom was one thing, But now she had to focus on the next steps. The business, which had been so central to their lives, still needed to be dealt with. There was so much left to rebuild, and Elizabeth knew that the fight for her late husband's legacy was far from done. Victor stood up, his face a mask of frustration and disbelief. Elizabeth could see the anger bubbling beneath the surface, but there was nothing he could do now. The decision had been made. There was no way to undo it. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "This isn't over. You don't know what you're getting into. I won't just sit back and let you take everything." Elizabeth didn't flinch. She had been prepared for this. She had known from the start that Victor wouldn't go down without a fight. But now that the decision was in her favor, she didn't need to fear his threats. "I don't want to fight anymore," she replied calmly, her voice steady. "I just want to honor my husband's memory, his work, and his wishes. This is about what Charles wanted, not about what you want." For a moment there was silence. Victor glared at her, but he didn't respond. He knew deep down that he had lost. And in that silence, Elizabeth felt something inside her shift. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she was in control of her own future. The judge gave a small nod, signaling that the proceedings were over. The gavel fell, the finality of the sound echoing in the room. The court was adjourned. Elizabeth stood up, her legs feeling weaker than she had anticipated. But as she walked out of the courtroom, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The road ahead would be difficult. She still had a business to rebuild, a legacy to protect, and a future to build on her own. But for the first time in months, she felt like she could handle it. She had stood up for herself, for Charles, and for everything they had built together. She wasn't going to let anyone take that away from her.